Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss the importance of boxing in the shattering of white supremacy with historian Gerald Horn.
There are these ideas about black masculinity that are shattered. These ideas of black masculinity were used as a justification for Jim Crow, for this so-called inferior caste, speaking of black men in particular. Then you had the reality that after these black boxers were able to accumulate a sort of wealth, a kind of wealth, they were able to pour some of that income into progressive causes. It's not just Jack Johnson, Joe Louis, and Muhammad Ali. There are scores of other boxers who acted similar. And this provided the wherewithal for anti-Jim Crow organizations and movements to be able to hire staff, to hire lawyers, to mobilize people in the streets. So boxing is an important story to discuss when you're trying to understand social, political, and economic change in the United States of America.
Slaveholders in the antebellum South frequently staged boxing matches between men they held in bondage. This bondage changed little after slavery, when black boxers were managed by white promoters as if they were thoroughbred horses. Boxing was, as the historian Gerald Horn writes in his new book, The Bittersweet Science, Racism, Racketeering, and the Political Economy of Boxing, the ne plus ultra of capitalism, endowed with its primary accoutrements: white supremacy, masculinity, violence, profiteering, and corruption. Those exploited in the ring, like those exploited on plantations, were physically broken before reaching old age. It is estimated that 87% of boxers suffer brain damage. Between 1945 and 1985, 370 pugilists died from boxing injuries. But at the same time, with very few opportunities for blacks, boxing was a way to battle back against white supremacy, especially when striking a white man in the South could mean death, while beating a white man senseless in the ring saw black boxers compensated and even lionized. At the height of segregation and lynching, it was possible to attend fights, or as many blacks did, listen to radio broadcasts where black boxers beat into incoherence those who arrogantly defined themselves as the superior race. The cultural importance of the boxing champion Joe Louis, for example, who competed from 1934 to 1951 and reigned as the world heavyweight champion from 1937 to 1949, was immense. He was the first person of African American descent in the United States to achieve the status of a nationwide hero, shattering, with his athletic prowess, the negative stereotypes used by whites to dismiss blacks as lazy, yellow, dim-witted, and inferior. Joining me to discuss the intersection of white supremacy, capitalism, and boxing is the historian Gerald Horn, the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, and the author of The Bittersweet Science, Racism, Racketeering, and the Political Economy of Boxing. So I didn't mention Jack Johnson in the intro. We'll talk about him. He didn't achieve Joe Louis's position because he wasn't as obsequious as he was writing the book as Johnson was. But let's go all the way back to slavery, because this was, I didn't know this till I read your book, this was a kind of sporting event for white slaveholders.
Well, yes. I mean, there's the phenomenon known as the Battle Royale, whereby a number of young black men, 7, 8, for example, are blindfolded, put into the ring, and told to go at it. The one who emerges triumphant is given some sort of prize. And in fact, Bo Jack from Augusta, GA, who in the 1940s is one of the biggest draws at Madison Square Garden in New York City as a lightweight champion, oftentimes prevailed in a battle royale in Augusta, Georgia, which of course is also the home of the Masters Golf Tournament. I should also point out that even before reaching these shores in Africa, coincidentally enough, as the slave trade begins to exert itself aggressively in southwestern Africa and Angola, in southeastern Africa and Madagascar, you have certain kinds of martial arts that arise. For example, capoeira, which is still practiced in Brazil, which is a kind of ballet and martial arts. It's suggested by certain scholars that capoeira's roots are involved in resisting enslavers. In other words, you cannot begin to understand how and why it was, and to a certain degree is, possible that Black Americans were so successful in the boxing ring without understanding their material conditions. That is to say, there's a school of, quote, scholarship, unquote, using the term advisedly, that suggests that Black Americans have excelled because of some sort of genetic makeup. I don't think that that's altogether accurate. I think that it's nurture more so than nature. And with regard to nurture, I would also point out the concept of masculinity. Although it may be hard to imagine today, some decades ago, the idea was afloat that somehow Black men were not real men because real men do not allow themselves to be treated so atrociously. And this particular idea, it seems to me, helped to inspire Black boxers decades ago to try to excel in the ring in order to beat that concept into smithereens. And indeed, I would say that that then helps to create this kind of overall culture whereby fighting against these toxic masculinity ideas, fighting against white supremacy, the need to accumulate material wealth in a capitalist society, all that combines to create these great black boxing champions. And I would also say that the kind of aggressiveness that you see growing out of that matrix that I've just sketched also may help to shed light on why it is that today about 3/4 of the football players in the National Football League happen to be Black Americans. That is to say, the cultural arguments, the nurture arguments help to explain this phenomenon more so than the so-called nature arguments.
One of the things I learned in my book that I didn't know was the prevalence of Jewish fighters, especially around the turn of the 20th century. And I think you make an argument that, because there were so few avenues open to people who were in oppressed circumstances, they found boxing as a kind of route to achieve money and status within the society when other avenues were closed to them. So, I mean, the proliferation of Jewish boxers was, quite high, especially in the lower weight classes.
That's absolutely correct. And once again, I think you can understand this phenomenon through a nurture rather than a nature argument. I don't think that there was any particular genetic makeup of Jewish Americans that helped to explain why they were excelling in the ring. It's interesting when you look at the oral histories of these great Jewish boxers. So often they talk about how they had to use their fists against their Italian-American and Irish-American neighbors. And that's what helps to account for their excelling in the ring. It's also striking to note that there are anecdotes about young Jewish men in concentration camps who are instructed by their captors to fight for the enjoyment and the entertainment of their captors, not unlike the battle royale that I just described in Augusta, Georgia. Interestingly enough, what happens after 1945, you see a diminishing of Jewish success in the ring, mostly because what happens is that as a result of World War II, you have a certain discrediting of Hitlerism, a certain discrediting of anti-Semitism, and with the anti-Jim Crow movement, it's oftentimes forgotten, you not only have a social and economic elevation of Black Americans, you have a social and economic elevation of Jewish Americans as well. and it's not as necessary for them to use their fists in the ring to accumulate material success. They can accumulate material success by going to graduate school or going to professional schools, for example, or climbing the greasy pole of success on Wall Street, for example. And so it's very interesting that you have these parallels from these two groups in U.S. society, that is to say Jewish Americans and Black Americans. And I guess I would be remiss if I failed to point out that you had a similar success in the state of Georgia just a few days ago, when you had the first Black American senator elected, the first Jewish American senator elected, and as many commentators neglected to note, Georgia featured about 105 years ago a rather rancid anti-Semitism that led to the lynching of Leo Frank, a Jewish American business manager. And it was that particular gruesome episode that convinced many Jewish Americans to accelerate their involvement in the civil rights movement, contributing to the NAACP, which then culminates with this discrediting of anti-Semitism that I described a moment or two ago.
I want to talk about Jack Johnson, a fascinating figure on so many levels. And he also lives at this, he's a contemporary of W.E.B. Du Bois, probably America's greatest intellectual, and Booker T. Washington. I will not attach an adjective to Booker T. Washington, but talk about him and his importance. Many people argue the greatest heavyweight ever.
So Jack Johnson, born in Galveston, Texas in 1878, and achieving international prominence as the heavyweight boxing champion, defeating a Euro-American competitor in Reno, Nevada in 1910. This leads to a search for a so-called Great White Hope to defeat Jack Johnson and, in the minds of some, restore normalcy with regard to the construction of masculinity. Some in your audience may be familiar with the movie starring James Earl Jones, The Great White Hope, which depicts the life of Jack Johnson. Because of his success, you had an attempt to ban boxing films, because oftentimes what happened is that if a boxing film of Jack Johnson defeating a Euro-American competitor was shown, for example, in Dixie, the Dixiecrats felt that this would unnecessarily inflate the ego and the confidence of Black Americans to the detriment of the Dixiecrats. So you had an attempt to wholesale ban such boxing films. Ultimately, what happened to Jack Johnson is that spurious charges were brought